to Washington, D.C., and to Cincinnati to attend the National Council of Black Studies Conference, where they'll present their research. I want to thank my colleagues, Dr. Alyssa Cole, Dr. Kevin Winstead, Dr. Jay Young, and all the others who help the students prepare their presentations, mentor our students, do the revise, and really representing what Black Studies is all about. And of course, all our Mellon Scholars, we expect them all to pay it forward. Next, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Deidre Cooper Owens is an associate professor of history and Africana studies at the University of Connecticut. Before her most recent appointment, she simultaneously directed the program in African American history at the Library Company of Philadelphia and headed a medical humanities program at the University of Nebraska. During that time, she's the only Black woman in the country who directed an academic medical humanities program. Dr. Cooper Owens is a popular public speaker, writer, and reproductive justice advocate who is an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer, a past American College of Obstetricians, and Gynecologists Fellow, and a newly elected member of the American Antiquarian Society and the Advisory Council of SHEAR, Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. Dr. Cooper Owens has won several prestigious honors and awards for scholarly and advocacy work in history and reproductive and birthing justice. Her first book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, won a Darlene Clark Hine Book Award from the Organization of American Historians as the best book written in African American women's and gender history. It has been translated into Korean. She is currently working on a popular biography about Harriet Tubman that examines her life through the lens of disability, and a historical monograph about race, medical discovery, and the C-section with origins in Louisiana. Without further ado, let's recognize Dr. Deidre Cooper Owens. Class.
The tech things together, and I am just going to move this mic here. Move it back and bring it a little closer so you can hear me. It is my great pleasure to be here. I see some familiar faces, some new faces, and I'd like to thank the Department of Women and Gender Studies and also African American Studies. There are so many colleagues to thank, but especially Alyssa Cole, who invited me here and who has been absolutely amazing hosting me. Dr. Canton, my Morehouse brother, and I'm not a Spelman grad, I'm a Bennett grad. So he can tell you all about that history. And then Dr. Winstead, there are a number of other people. So thank you so much for just being wonderful hosts. So I am talking about a section of American history that for quite some time have been, I think, under-researched and not really known. And when I first discovered it was in a seminar when I was still a grad student in 2005. And this is before people knew about Henrietta Lacks, before they knew about and Narca, Betsy, Lucy, and James Marion Sims. The only thing that we kind of sort of knew around, the atrocities with medical experimentation was the Tuskegee syphilis study. That was it. And so I read these lines, about 2 sentences in a book called Gender Talk that was written by Deidre Cooper and Beverly Guy Sheffield, who is a theorist in Africana women's studies. Dr. Cole was the then president of Bennett College, and I've always had a big mouth, so I was moderating the program with Dr. Cole and the late Reverend James Lawson of SNCC. And I'm reading their book, and I see 2 sentences that talk about medical experimentation on enslaved women by this guy known as the father of American gynecology, James Marion Sims, and I was captivated because I'm thinking, wait, I went to an HBCU for women. I had gotten a master's degree from another HBCU, Clark Atlanta University, and did not know a thing about this, right? And so I thought think I have a dissertation topic, right? And so it's often interesting when I get these talks, I get these talks and students and sometimes colleagues will say, oh my God, this book was so prescient. How did you know to write about it? I was like, child, it's actually sad because that means medical racism has still been a thing when it comes to the birthing crisis. So, you know, this was not something I knew was going to be a part of public discourse and our conversations around health disparities. But as a historian, I think it opens up a new window into understanding the 19th century and slavery in particular. So with that, thank you so much. And we are going to talk about why Black mothers matter, right? So I first want to start with the Journal of the American Medical Association. So former editor, and he's an MD, Dr. Ed Livingston, decided that the AMA needed to, needed to center a conversation on medical racism. And so with the journal being the communications organ, he says, okay, you know what? We're going to have a podcast series. I'll invite one of my colleagues, a leading physician in New York, and we're going to have this talk around medical racism because this was also during the era of high COVID. And so what he does, he sends out a tweet. And it says, no physician is racist. So how can there be structural racism in healthcare? Now this was to promote a podcast on structural racism. So he's already made the conclusion, right? So, as you might imagine, there was an uproar amongst MDs, even internally within the American Medical Association. They had a Black woman who had been hired, a pediatrician named Dr. Aletha Maybank, and Aletha Maybank she had done all of these really wonderful things to create more equity in the organization, and then here comes this kind of blowback to everything that she had done. And so what does Dr. Livingston, what does he do? He wipes it clean, right? So that you can't find the tweet, the podcast is taken off, and then a number of historians of medicine, medical doctors, and activists were like, no, we have to be able to understand the archives and also the resistance that we're facing. And the fact that Dr. Livingston says, right, personally, I think taking racism out of the conversation will help. Many people like myself are offended by the implication that we are somehow racist. So he was much more concerned about his feelings than the fact that the United States, since they have been collecting data on births, right, is the most dangerous place for Black women and birthing people to be pregnant and give birth. So he was removed from the position, although they said, anytime you hear they voluntarily resign, trust me, that means we are not going to sue you, but you got to go, right? So he stepped down voluntarily. But for me, it opens up a larger conversation. Because if you have really well-learned folk who hold positions of power, who poo-poo the idea that medical racism even exists, where does this come from? When all of the data, all of the science says otherwise. And so I start with the 19th century. And so there's a guy named Samuel Cartwright. He was pretty prolific as a medical writer. He was an MD, he was a slave owner. And Sam Cartwright was asked in the late 1840s, early 1850s by the Louisiana State Medical Association to conduct research on two groups of people, Black people and white people, right? And I'm going to use a historical term. So they say, hey, we need you to do research on the Negro to find out if there are either similarities or distinctions between Black and white people, and he gets to work. And so what Sam Cartwright finds, right, he publishes in 1851, and it makes a huge splash. He writes on the distinctiveness of the Negro race. All of the Black people that he studied were enslaved, and obviously the white folk were free. So what he found was really interesting. He found that Black people have thicker skin. They're more prone to be bow-legged. They were more prone to eat dirt. They aged faster. Black people also suffer from a very distinctive medical condition. It was a mental illness called drapetomania. And that meant that if you were enslaved, if you harbored the thought of running away or you ran away, you were mentally ill. And so today we might laugh at those and say, oh, this is pseudoscience. It was not. He received an MD from Transylvania University. It was the first medical school in the United States. He was obviously important enough for the Louisiana State Medical Association to ask him to conduct this research. And his research was in fact so influential that if you look to my far left, it's a cover of a book jacket. That's a 19th century version of a spirometer, or an instrument that's used to assess lung capacity. His research becomes so important that the Union Army, not the Confederate, the Union Army, so this means the official military unit of the United States government during the Civil War, uses his research when they then begin investigative research on the Negro and white soldiers, right? Because they're trying to figure out, is the Negro fit to fight in the Civil War? Just like the Louisiana State Medical Association doesn't say explicitly, we want you to do this research, because we're trying to figure out, is the Negro fit for freedom? Because there had been all kinds of public discourse and scientific and medical research trying to figure out if slavery was actually more beneficial to the health and the sanity of Black people. So oftentimes when I was running the medical humanities program during my 4 years at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, often my students were STEM students. I didn't teach a lot of history students, which was kind of weird, right? Because I write about dead people, right? That's always, I write about dead people. And yet here I was teaching people who wanted to be nurses and doctors and dentists and all of those things. And so I'm telling them, you think that you are dealing with a field or fields that are value neutral. They are not. Because human beings are the ones who are the administrators, who are the researchers, right? And human beings always bring biases. I don't care who you are, right? How objective you think you are, you're bringing your own biases. And so the Louisiana State Medical Association had a very political motive behind asking a well-respected physician and medical writer and researcher to do this kind of research, because they wanted to be able to prove that in fact the Negro race and the white race were distinctive biologically, right? And that's what his research was able to prove. He even finds that with his spirometer research, right, where you literally breathe into the machine to assess your lung capacity, that the Negro has lessened lung capacity. Unless we think this was novel, he was building on research from scientists, from public figures and thinkers like Thomas Jefferson, who wrote about the lessened lung capacity of the Negro in his only book in 1804, Notes on the State of Virginia. Even before that, in 1799, Benjamin Rush, known as the father of American medicine, the father of American psychiatry, he writes in his talk on the Negro and leprosy, that the disease of leprosy that is what causes Blackness, right? And so he says, the Negro has lessened lung capacity. He was able to reach back into the mid 18th century, so that's the 1700s, for those folk who were doing kind of tropical medicine, right? And build upon that research. So literally from the 18th century to the 19th century, you have, all of this information that points to the biological differences between Black and white people. Now, there is a part of me that I call the petty labelle. That might be aging me. But for you young people, there was a soul singer. She's still living. She's in her early 80s. Her name is Patti LaBelle. But I call it Patti LaBelle. And let me tell you why. Because every time I would give this talk, there was typically, it was always the same person after the talk would say, oh my gosh, this is so horrible. What happened to the enslaved women? But doctors don't really listen to women anyway. It was almost always, I'm being charitable here, I think, a well-meaning, typically middle-class white woman. And so the Patti LaBelle in me said, okay, let me go on and add some 21st century stats. Boom! So that's what I did. I said, let me bring it from the 19th century, right, to the 21st century. And so Kelly Hoffman was a doctoral student in 2014 at the University of Virginia. Unless anybody think I'm picking on UVA, I love UVA. I did my postdoc there, right, at the Woodson Institute for Africana Studies. So, you know, I'm not picking on the school, but it's a pretty highly ranked school, right? It's pretty competitive. Some of you might go there for grad school or med school or nursing school. And so Kelly Hoffman and her research team, she decides, I'm going to collect research and I'm going to survey some lay people, but mainly medical residents and students. And so what she and her team, what they do was, you know, it wasn't even that novel. They essentially come up with twin cases, black patient, white patient. And so they come up with these cases that are pretty painful. Now, I've never given birth, but many of you have. I hear it's not necessarily the most pleasant physical experience, but there's some pain involved. You know, I'm just saying, you know. And then for kidney stones, I've never had it, but my husband, who is much bigger than me and broad and tall, it was the first time I saw that man like literally in the fetal position crying. I mean, it is painful. They say, you know, doctors say it feels like if men could give birth, that's what it feels like. The kidney stones are extremely painful. So they create these twin scenarios, and they literally have just a white patient and a black patient, and 67% of the almost 300 people who were surveyed, this was under anonymity, so they had the protection of anonymity. They said, in medical school, after taking the Hippocratic Oath during a white coat ceremony, black people and white people are biologically different. Black people have thicker skin. Black people age faster than white people. 2 of the respondents said, black people are born with tails. Now, lest we, and it was published in 2016, not even 10 years ago. So this is the really interesting thing for me, because I often get folks who are like, how could these people do that? A, it was anonymous. There were no names attached. So the anonymity protected you. But then number 2, these are students just like you, right? This is a high-ranked university. You have all of these, you know, really well-known and highly regarded scholars who are teaching you, and I can almost guarantee that none of you are reading science books that are saying that human beings are distinctive and one is a separate species and the other is a separate species. There's not one science book that you can probably point me to on this campus that will say that. And then for the people who are going to medical school, guess what you have to take? There's a test called the MCAT. And I can guarantee you they're not putting that anti-blackness when they, and you know, bubbling the answers or writing it out. So one has to wonder, what is the investment in that level of anti-blackness when you've already taken an oath that says do no harm? Because it's clearly not the books. It's clearly not what they're learning in the classroom. And so there's something about the cloak of anonymity that allowed some of those folks investment in anti-blackness to take over. And that's not me being hyperbolic, right? And then there are a number of studies that come out of the University of Chicago, Yale, Harvard, right? I could go on and on and on, that literally mirrors Dr. Hoffman's research, right? And so it was really telling for me, right, to be able to say, many of those students in 2014 believe the same thing that Sam Cartwright discovered in his research in the 1850s. So where does that take us? What does that mean for those of us who are living in this moment, right? For me, as a historian who writes about these folks, knowing too that a lot of the public education that this country, you know, has mandated means that history is often not taught well, right? And so the job of a historian is not to be able to provide you with trivia to win Jeopardy points, right? That's not it at all. It really is to provide context. Like, that's what we care about the most. How nuanced is your thinking, right? How analytical are you when you're presented with this information? And so when my book came out in 2017, there were 2 crises, right? So one was this crisis of, you know, college students were out here I mean, they were angry. They found out information. They were like, let me topple some statues, right? And so all throughout the South, who knows, University of Florida might have been one of them, but they were taking down statues and tagging them and doing all the things because they were just like, we are tired of these Confederate, these statues of Confederate officers on our campus or on our main streets. And so a lot of folk in the North thought they were, somehow absolved of this. But I was teaching at a little place called Queens College in Queens, New York. And so New Yorkers weren't really concerned until this moment. 4 young people in a group called the Black Youth Project 100, BYP 100, decided that they were going to protest the placement of James Marion Sims' statue in Central Park, because his statue was located in the easternmost part of Central Park, which is near East Harlem, and right across from the New York Academy of Medicine. So these 4 young women, Jewel Cadet is the one in the turban, she was the one who organized it. They did a political and artistic protest around Sims and the placement of that statue there. They wanted it removed. And so they donned hospital gowns to celebrate the lives and the contributions of the enslaved women that he operated on. And Narca, Betsy, Lucy are the names of 3 of them. We don't know the names of the other. And so I was kind of brought into this conversation. And at the heart of it too was not just about the placement of these statues and symbols and what they represented, but it was also about the legacy of medical racism. And so when I said, okay, I guess I'll enter into this public discourse because my book was about to come out, I had to talk about this, right? Was Sims exceptional? Because every article I read said Sims was exceptionally cruel. He butchered the reproductive parts of Black women, right? And even when I spoke with Jewel Cadet, I remember saying, she was like, I can't stand this man. I was like, girl, he's already dead, right? He's already dead. And she's like, but he did this and he did that. And I had to tell her that it doesn't work like that, right? Let me tell you about slavery. Not just in what becomes the United States, but slavery in the West. It was racial chattel slavery, meaning human beings are turned into objects. In the United States, it becomes based on race. And then they do this thing, particularly in the 1600s, right? So different colonies had different laws. One of the most famous is 1662. The House of Burgess in England allows the colony of Virginia to create partus sequitur ventrum. And what that means is if you are an enslaved woman and you are pregnant and you give birth to your child, the only thing that you can pass on to your child is your lifelong servitude. It literally upends patriarchal law. Because remember, this is a British colony. Britain is very patriarchal. But guess what was happening? Enslaved women were getting impregnated by the very men who owned them. And what that meant was, if you could prove that that child had a white father, that child would have to be free. So because slavery at its core is an economic labor institution, boom, they changed the law. So for centuries, right, the one thing that Black women are allowed to give their children through inheritance is slavery. So why would a slave-owning physician like Sims butcher the reproductive body parts, right, of enslaved women? What's the cost-benefit analysis of making these women infertile? Right? And so I'm like, remember, I have to provide context. So you'll notice a pattern. The Petty LaBelle part of my personality was, let me go on and make the first chapter, my roots chapter. Once again, I'm aging myself. For you young people, there was a miniseries, 1977, I was 5, Alex Haley popularized it. He basically traces his family history from America all the way back to West Africa, right? I mean, we then later learned parts of it was plagiarized. But forgetting all of that aside, right? What it does is sparks like this whole genealogical interest, particularly by Black people who were middle class. Like my mother is a family genealogist. She was able to trace our ancestry back to South Carolina when it was still a British colony. right? That's pretty incredible for most Black people in this country who don't get past like 2 generations. So it sparks this interest, but what it did for me was, you know what, I grew up in the low country of South Carolina, and this saying, you know, tell the truth and shame the devil. So I was like, let me do that. Let me go on and just put the whole intellectual genealogy down here. Sims was not unique. Sims was not, no matter how many times you see it on TikTok videos, or, you know, DJ Vlad had D.L. Hughley and he was talking about, you know, it was this man known as the father of American gynecology, and he was the one who said Black people didn't experience pain. No, he wasn't. No, he wasn't. Because then that exceptionalizes Sims. And when I wrote this book, I wasn't interested in creating historical boogeymen. That doesn't serve anyone. I was interested in how do we understand structural and systemic inequalities, right, or imbalances. And so this part of the book is really, I'm going to show you by tracing backwards how Sims literally inherits the ideologies or sets of beliefs that he has about Black people, about women. So I start with Georges Cuvier. Arguably France's some might argue Europe's most well-known natural historian, or like a researcher, right, a man of science. And why is he important to my research? So most people are interested in Cuvier for lots of different reasons, right? But I was really interested in his treatment of a South African-born woman named Saartjie Baartman, who was derisively known as a Hottentot Venus. So Saartjie Baartman is bought and sold from South Africa. She's sold to an Englishman who was an Englishman, and then the brother of her owner in South Africa. She's taken to England, and then she's later sold to a person in France, and then the National Museum of Paris essentially gets ownership of Baartman, and she's made to live in their menagerie, which is where you examine plants and animals. This is, you know, at this point, the very early 19th century, so the very early part of the 1800s. And Saartjie Baartman is young. I mean, she's much like many of you who I look out in the audience, right? A young woman, she has gone through an awful lot. And Cuvier is intrigued with this woman who at the time was the only South African-born person brought to England and Paris. And they see her as this oddity. And what Cuvier is really interested in, is she the missing link between humans and apes? And so he's constantly trying to examine her, to experiment on her. And she doesn't allow him to do so. And even you can look at some of the writings with Cuvier and his colleagues, and they say, well, we know that she likes to receive money, right? You know, kind of euphemism of she had to do sex work. I mean, she was, you know, had an over-dependency on alcoholism. She didn't live a happy life, right? And so eventually she dies at the age of 25. And he's finally able to perform an autopsy on Baartman's body. And guess what he finds? She's a regular human being. You can look at her skeletal remains. There's nothing that is different about her. But when she was living, because of the size of her buttocks, and that's what, you know, lots of folk were really interested in. Essentially, why is her butt so big? And so, you know, the bustle that becomes a fashion trend in Europe was based off Baartman's body. To this day, there's a medical pathology known as steatopegia, the enlargement of the buttocks, that's based off Baartman. So essentially, the South African woman who's shaped like the Khoi people that she comes from is seen as this kind of medical, you know, pathological thing. He also wants to know, does she have a Hottentot, you know, hooded labia? She doesn't. So what he does, he cleans all of the skin and the tendons and the veins and basically the flesh off her bones, right? Her skeleton is put on display. Her brain is preserved, put in a bell jar, put on display. Her genitalia is cut off, preserved, put in a bell jar, put on display. From the time she dies, and I believe it was 1813, until 1974, when her brain and her genitalia were lost or stolen, she was on display. France does not give her skeletal remains back to South Africa until the 21st century. But why is that important for me? Because even after death, there was a value in the afterlife of enslaved people. And so if you were interested in medicine or science, right, what could you learn from the black body, right? What was it about the black body that was so different, right, that medical knowledge could be constructed and produced from it? If we move across the pond to Ephraim McDowell, not as well known as Sims, but Ephraim McDowell was known as the father of variotomy. Guess what he has in common? Slave-owning physician. Originally born in Virginia, moves out west back then to Kentucky. And Ephraim McDowell first experiments on a white woman who came with a swollen belly, suffered from a lot of abdominal pain. She knows she isn't pregnant because she had children before. And so after his research and reading, McDowell, he decides you probably have an ovarian tumor. And so on Christmas morning, when he knows the townspeople are asleep, and also surgeries were quite rare. Most people died if you performed an abdominal incision. So he does this, he sneaks her into his office on Christmas morning because he knows people will be asleep. He also had robbed a grave and performed a legal autopsy on an enslaved man. So people already, they didn't have much faith in him in terms of his ethics. But he performs this surgery, and the woman lives. Mary Todd Crawford was her name. She lives amazingly, right? And she lives until old age, like several decades later. But during this time, Ephraim McDowell says, you know what, if I can remove a 20-pound plus tumor from this woman and she lives, I wonder how I can perfect my surgical technique. And so he finds, and I'm using the words of his article, 5 negresses in Kentucky. Kentucky today still doesn't have a huge black population. So I was like, where in the world did he find these 5 black women? And how did he assume they had ovarian tumors? But he finds them, he performs surgeries, one of them dies. We don't know their names because he never listed them. And so he decides after about 8 years of doing this experimental surgery, okay, I've perfected the technique, I'm gonna write a medical journal article and it is going to change my life. And it doesn't, unfortunately, right? He publishes it and he is ridiculed, he is teased. In fact, in the Lancet, which was then considered the leading medical journal of the Western world, Dr. Johnson says, well, of course, those women would bear cutting of the knife with the impunity of dogs and rabbits, animals that reproduce quickly, because they were black, they were negresses. And so Ephraim McDowell, right, is kind of sidelined into the marginalia of history. But he is doing this kind of research, right? And this is the thing. The Atlantic world response from his peers is that black women reproduce quickly and they don't experience pain. He began the surgeries in 1809, he publishes in 1817. Sims doesn't conduct his experimental research until the 1840s, right? People already had an idea about black difference. Francois Prevost, he was born in France, receives his MD there, does some work in Haiti. There's a little thing called the Haitian Revolution, so he skedaddles, comes to a former French colony, the state of Louisiana, right? And he settles outside of Baton Rouge in the most prosperous parish there, Ascension. Essentially, it's really prosperous because of the many plantations. So, and this historical marker has some inaccurate information, but in the very early 1830s, Francois Marie Prevost becomes the second American to perform 2 successful cesarean sections. He does so in enslaved women. He even names one of the babies after the surgery, cesarean. So what does this tell us about these slave-owning physicians who are doing these kinds of surgeries, right? A, we know how important enslaved people were. I was trying to find things out about Prevost. He doesn't leave a lot of writings. Other people are writing about him. And so I'm just Googling, and any of your professors can tell you, you're often just alone on your computer, like just putting in keywords, trying to see what comes up. And amazingly, a group of activists in Chicago decide they are going to sue a lot of really well-known banks. And most of these banks back in the day were smaller banks, and they just kind of become bigger, and so there's a monopoly. But some of those big banks that we know of today, Bank of America, those kinds of places, they bought up a number of smaller banks. Some of those banks had ties to the 19th century, and many of them literally allowed slave owners to mortgage their property, right? So the property, is comprised of humans and land. And so in 1833, this is right around the time he performs those surgeries on those two women, Prevost mortgages his plantation, and these are the enslaved people that he owns. Now, I don't know if any of these women, are the folk that he experiments on, but it just shows you how valuable slavery is to them and the kind of access it allows them. But this is the more important thing for me, where I said I don't believe in exceptionality and historical boogeymen. Because the reason I'm writing this book, the new book on the C-section, is until 2014. So imagine 1831 to 2014, Louisiana was the state that was ranked #1 in its overuse of Black women's bodies for C-sections. The only state that knocked it down to #2 is Mississippi, which has a larger population, a larger Black population in Louisiana. So for me, when people are, I hate Sims, and I'm saying, look at the legacy that we're stuck with. From 1831 until the 21st century, Louisiana continued to overuse surgery on Black people and Black women and birthing people. And think about this. I don't know for anyone who's had a C-section, doctors are taught how to take the organs out. They're not taught how to put them back properly. And essentially that means you're taking out intestines, all of those things. And oftentimes they're being stuffed back in to your cavity. So there are complications after this. Can you imagine the kind of complications and pain that ensues, right? These are the things that I'm talking about when I say structural and systemic, right? So the person who performs the surgery that most people kind of don't know about because it's not very common today, right? That performs the surgery that is the one that James Marion Sims perfects is John Peter Matau, another slave-owning physician, this time in Virginia. He also was an institution builder. He creates the Randolph-Macon College of Medicine. It's no longer in existence. But he decides that he's going to perform this obstetrical fistula surgery. So essentially, in the 19th century, it's called vesicovaginal fistula. All that means is you're pregnant, you're trying to give birth, and you cannot expel the fetus or the baby. And so you're literally trying to expel your baby for days. It's very prolonged. And as you can imagine, if this is the upper vaginal area here, you're trying to expel this baby, there's all of this friction that happens, and it creates a fistula or a hole. It can range from gaping, so you can actually see the hole, to something that's very microscopic. And so it doesn't kill you. I've read things where it's like, it was deadly. It was not. But what it did was it created a lot of social ostracism, because guess what's, if this is the upper vaginal area, guess what's above it? The bladder. So incontinence, and if there are rips or tears in the back, there's incontinence there too. So a lot of the women get infections, there's a stench. Many of them were forced to live, away from others because of the smell. These are women who are giving birth, women and girls who are giving birth, so they're relatively young, right? And if you can imagine, having to live through that, right? And be kept away from friends and family. So John Peter Matau conducts research on an enslaved woman suffering from this condition and a white woman. And so when I read the article, I was less concerned about the reparative methods of the surgical techniques that he used. I was really looking for how was he writing about a white woman and a black woman who essentially had the same condition. And so he performs the experimental surgery. The white woman is allowed to rest because she's free. And so she has a recuperative period. And amazingly, he says, I cured her, I fixed her. The enslaved woman, though, who was 19, is not allowed to rest. Because guess what? If you are enslaved, you don't get like vacation or holiday leave. I know some of the textbooks are like, they were like interns that had a maritime voyage. They were not, right? They were not, I'm just saying. And so this woman is not allowed to rest. I mean, she's enslaved. And so he writes, I performed 8 clinical trials, his language. And he said the patient was still not cured. If she had stopped engaging in sexual intercourse, perhaps she could have been healed. Sir, you are a slave owner. You know good and well that women cannot control, especially when they are owned, who has access to their bodies. But beyond that, what if she was in a loving relationship with an enslaved man? And that was a way that she wanted to express herself, right? But what it showed me was, and I'll use 21st century language here, the social determinants of health, right, meant that slavery mattered. And slavery had deleterious, negative effects on the body. That this woman who was enslaved, who literally went through the same procedure, could not be healed. It also taught me that physicians continue to blame their patients for negative medical outcomes. And that is something that still happens today, right? I've heard it and read it all. Oh, if black women weren't so fat, they wouldn't suffer all of these complications. I was like, black people didn't invent McDonald's, Popeyes, KFC, Burger King, Wendy's. I was like, the average American woman wears a size 16. Not the average black woman, the average American woman, which is considered plus size. So how is it that only black women and birthing people are the ones who literally are being affected in this particular way? All right? But the patient blaming is a part of it. And then lastly, James Marion Sims, right? The father of American gynecology. Most people, are more familiar with his name. And he's the one who, he comes up with a reparative method that doctors still use to this day. But I was much more interested in what I could learn from the archive of the enslaved wound. Because I was speaking with Dr. Cole, or it could have been Dr. Kent, and I can't remember, but I was like, when you're a historian of slavery, we don't have books that come out like every 2-3 years, because you're dealing with a population that did not leave written records, right? Everybody's not Frederick Douglass. So that means I can't just go into an archive and say, give me the Harriet Tubman papers. Harriet Tubman lived to be 91, she was illiterate. Sojourner Truth, illiterate, right? These women that I write about, half the time I don't know their names. So I have to be able to put together the fragments of their lives and how they responded to each other, to those who owned them, to those who operated on them, right? To those who sexually abused them. I have to be able to try to put together as best I can fragments of their lives from these various sources. And that takes a really long time. And then you're doing comparative histories, right? Because it can't just be a book about the patients. I have to include the doctors and all of these things, right? So for me, what was there to learn from the archival enslaved wound? And I learned quite a bit, right? What I learned was when James Marion Sims decided to, in his words, canvass the county looking for cases. What that meant was he entered into, I learned about the business relationship between slave owners, between institutions like colleges and hospitals, that you could go to someone who owned another human being and say, you know what, this person is sick, I am trying to heal them from this condition. I will then take ownership through leasing your property. And what that means is I'll feed them, I'll clothe them, right? I'll house them. And so he says he has a little hospital built for himself. And so I thought, this is interesting. So these people are being leased, just like how you lease a car. right? Or you even leisure hours if you ever tempt for work. But beyond that too, he creates the first hospital for women in the United States. Now remember I told you, I finished this book living in New York. And you could go right up to Manhattan and you could stand in front of what was formerly known as the Women's Hospital of the State of New York, and it is credited as being the first hospital created for women by James Marion Sims in 1855. And yet the man wrote in his own autobiography that he had a hospital built for himself for the treatment of women's problems and conditions. And that was in the 1840s. And it was in Montgomery, Alabama. So the first thing I did, lest I be accused of being a revisionist historian, I revised inaccurate history. And then the petty part of me, historians always do it. I put a little footnote. It's my first footnote, my first sentence. Because I don't have time to be creative. I'm only creative with my outfits. That's it, right? So I was like, try and tell me I plagiarized this. James Marion Sims wrote this about his own life and his contributions. The other thing James Marion Sims wrote, he first created a redeveloped speculum on the body of an enslaved woman. It's now called the Sims speculum. It's still used. The duckbill speculum. But even beyond that, he writes that when his two white medical assistants, his surgical assistants, two white men, one of them became one of his biggest critics, Nathan Bozeman, but when those two white men were like, people in the neighborhood are whispering that you're using these women like guinea pigs, we're just not sure, so they quit. Guess what he does? He trains his enslaved patients to serve as his surgical assistants and his nurses. And he does so at a time when women are thought to be the subset of men who are not guided by logic or their brains, they're guided by their uteri. But also that Black people live in an arrested state of development intellectually. And so he trains them though, because this is the thing. I call it racial cognitive dissonance. There can be something that is law or written and yet you know it's false. So even though they're like, oh, women are a subset of men. Black people are not smart. If they were not smart, you would not have depended on enslaved labor for centuries. And the United States wasn't even a century old, and yet it became the fourth richest economy in the world. That's pretty amazing. And it became the fourth richest economy largely because of slavery. So he knew that he didn't have to teach them anything differently than he taught his surgical assistants. But this was the amazing thing. When those enslaved women became his surgical assistants and nurses, he finally found a successful reparative treatment. Right? So those are the things that I look at. So then when you look in the medical journals though, even though Sims and all of his colleagues were very transparent, they had no reason to feel guilty or dishonest. If you read some of the Confederate writings and some of the slave owners' writings, you can learn a lot. Like when I was doing research for Harriet Tubman and I go into the Waring Library in South Carolina and I'm reading this Confederate book on I was trying to look at what Harriet Tubman might have used for natural healing and those kinds of things. And they're like, oh, the Bene seed, the Africans call it Bene seed. We know it as the sesame seed. They brought it over from Africa. Blah. I mean, it's like literally right there in your face. The people who were literally revising the history are their descendants. But the actual folk who lived are being really honest and truthful. I mean, there are certain exceptions. Like the image, right? So when you look at the image of some of the medical journals, I was like, oh, now I understand why people didn't necessarily believe that Black women were, contributing to Sims's surgical reparative treatment or technique. Because when you open up the book, if you're not reading the text, guess who the illustrators changed? Even though Sims is like, the Negresses did this, or my patient Betsy or Naka Lucy did this thing. When you open up the book, there's a whole erasure of Black people. So the text says a thing, but the images are different. And I remember even looking at Nathan Bozeman's, a dear colleague of mine, originally from Jacksonville, Florida, Dr. Nicole Ivy, She wrote this amazing article on Nathan Bozeman, and literally the same thing with the medical illustrations, right? So there is a whole erasure of the Black contributions of the building up of American gynecology. So where does that leave us now? Where that leaves us now is the legacy of medical racism. Many of you know this, because I've spoken with your professors. You're taking these classes, you know all the stats, right? So it's not new for me to tell you that the U.S. is the most dangerous place for Black women and birthing people to not just be pregnant, but to give birth. You see Black women 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than white women. And this is the thing that exceptionalizes Black women in particular. Most groups that have those kinds of great discrepancies around mortality and morbidity, there are things that typically protect people who have more money, more education, who are in secure relationships. That doesn't matter for Black women. In fact, it's more dangerous to be a Black woman who holds a PhD and pregnant and give birth than a Black woman with a high school diploma. So, I mean, many of the websites have been scrubbed. I can't necessarily say, go, get this information. But the CDC, I mean, there are so many studies, right? The March of Dimes that publish these stats. And unfortunately, they literally have not changed. I've spoken in so many states across this nation. And in every state, I mean, states with single-digit Black populations, the stats are literally the same. But because I don't believe in Black nihilism, I'm not an Afro-pessimist. No shame to those who are, but I'm not. Because you can't do this work and not believe that people are not working diligently to dismantle these systems of inequality. And so I often look to what Black women did then and what they're doing now. Right? Black Mamas Matter Alliance. In 2018, they created Black Maternal Health Week, April 11th through 17th. And I do have to give this funny story. At one point, I was always, when I saw April 17th, I was always like, because April 17th, 2018 was the day that the Sims statue was removed. That's my birthday. And I was like, damn you Sims, you continue to follow me. I'm like, why? And then the Black Maternal Health Week was created shortly thereafter. So I was like, okay, at least my birthday falls on something that is uplifting. Michelle Browder, she literally just finished her 4th annual Mothers of Gynecology conference. Smashing success, right? And so Michelle Browder, a child of Montgomery, Alabama, decides, you know what? My land is literally right across the corner. I mean, you can walk there from James Marion Sims' hospital and right across the street from Brian Stevenson's, the EJI, they used to call it the Lynching Museum. So she's like, wait, I have family land here. And she's an artist. And so what she decided to do was tell a kind of retelling of the history of gynecology, but she wanted to center the lives of Anarcha Betsy Lucy. And so she does so with her sculptures. And then she decided to create this conference. And I remember at first it was in a church. I was the first speaker at the conference, the first keynote lecturer. The second time I came, she was like, she has a very Southern Alabama accent. She was like, Deidre! I don't even correct her. I'm like, girl, her name is Deirdre. But I don't know. She's like, Deidre, girl, I gotta tell you something. I'm going with some donuts tonight for dinner. You wanna go? I said, yeah. So she drives me by the Sims hospital. And I was like, okay. And then she says, girl. And so I'm looking. She said, look closer. And I look, and they're like, I mean, Michelle has a very particular aesthetic about how she presents her surroundings and how she decorates and designs it. So I'm looking, I was like, wait, why is your stuff in there? And she bought it. And that was just amazing to think this Black woman was able to purchase the Sims Hospital, and it is now being used as a museum space, a cultural center. It will be used as a clinic, right? And so that's why I'm like, nihilism has no room, right, for the work that these people are doing. Kimberly Seals Allers, if you've ever heard of Black Breastfeeding Week, right? Here's a woman, once again, highly educated, went to Columbia University's School of Journalism, was this amazing, well-respected journalist, and she gives birth, and unfortunately, she has a really horrible time. Thankfully, the children are here, they're now grown, but she decides something has to be done, so she co-founds Black Breastfeeding Week. And then at the time her son is in high school, they were living in New York, and everybody offers coding classes now. And she says, I'm gonna send my son to coding class. And then she would ask him to teach her. And so they learn together, and they decide they are going to create an app that tracks the data of Black and brown women and birthing people's experiences from the moment they find out they're pregnant until after they give birth. And it became the Earth app. She says she dropped the B for bias, and you can download it on any smartphone. Right? And this is where I tend to do what I call the biggest petty label flex. Unless anybody says, oh, that UVA study had less than 300 people. Okay, it did. You're right. So I end with Rachel Hardiman, Black woman public health scholar from the University of Minnesota, doing amazing work. And she and her team decide they're going to look at almost 2 million records from a hospital here in Florida. Remember I said everywhere I go, I can literally find something that pertains to the state I'm in. And what she finds is, everybody always says race is the factor that creates these things. So basically, if you're Black, this is the deciding factor for these stats. And what we're always saying, the people who do what we do, we're like, it's not though. Because that's like saying Dr. King was killed because he was Black. No, he wasn't. He was killed because somebody was anti-Black. You don't put the onus on the person who gets murdered and dies. You put the onus on the murderer, right? And it wasn't Dr. King's Blackness. It was the fact that this person was anti-Black. And so that's not hyperbole or playing any kind of race card. That's just, it is what it is. And so what she says is, let's choose our language intentionally, and let's be more accurate. And so when she looks at those almost 2 million records from 1992 to 2015, so the late 20th century to the 21st century, just 10 years ago, guess what she finds? When there are Black practitioners at every level, so it doesn't matter if it's a pediatrician, OBGYN, if it's a lactation specialist, a doula, a midwife, whenever there is a pipeline and you have Black caretakers that are providing service and care for the birthing person or their children, the mortality and the morbidity rates are cut by over 50%. So that's the thing. We have to create more pipelines, right, so that we can get this. That doesn't mean that there are not Black birth workers who don't have really questionable and messed up ways of how they treat their patients. Nobody's saying that. But what we are saying is that when you cut out the anti-Blackness, the stats change in favor of these patients not experiencing those complications in their children living. So I'm going to end because I want to be able to get your questions and comments, but I always end with a quote from Octavia Butler, because I think she was amazing, and she was this speculative and science fiction writer from Pasadena, and I always say she was like a philosopher, but she just wrote science fiction and speculative fiction. And she had this quote where she said, there's nothing new under the sun, but we can all create new suns. And each of these women that I featured towards the end of my talk, right, they're simply utilizing the blueprint that was left for them. They're institution building, and they're simply placing love as the practice to be able to dismantle these systems and these structures to create fairness and equity for mothers and their children. So I thank you so much for your time, and I welcome your questions and your comments.
So we have a mic going around. If anybody have any questions? Oh, I think I have one.
Okay. And this is always the time where I say, I'm used to pregnant pauses. It's a corny joke, because people always have to process it and then ask the question.
We talked about during lunch, the Robert Kennedy stuff with the immune systems, right? 19th century scientific racism. I don't know what study he cited, but I'm guessing these ideas are still percolating somewhere. So how does one develop a new son to challenge that?
Yeah. I would say, if you're literate, you can read. This is a man who literally, Professor Kent and I spoke about this. His family has said he had a brain-eating bacteria. And he didn't say, no, they're lying. He was like, yes, I did. And so there's some cognitive decline. The other thing is he cited some study from Poland, and when he was pressed, he couldn't give you the name of it. He couldn't tell you the authors. He was like, oh, it's from Poland. Yes, because Poland has such a large Black population. So, when you have those kinds of things, what I do as a historian is I often teach students how to vet. And so what does that mean? How are you able to understand when something is accurate and it isn't accurate, right? And so once you have the skills to be able to know how to research correctly and to vet, you can then, like the woman who was, I can't remember, she was a representative or a senator, but who was pushing him. And essentially she said, so what you're saying is Black people are biologically different, that somehow vaccines affect us differently. Is that what you're saying? Because if you're saying that, then that means he's going against all the scientific evidence that's out there to prove otherwise, right? Biological essentialism is what prompted the creation of racial science in the 18th century. We thought by the 20th century it was done with, but clearly you have some folk who sit at the margins who are still pushing those kinds of narratives. But I would just say, my mother has a degree in biology. She's a retired science teacher. And, it was a privilege to be able to be a child and have a mother who understood science and who could explain things to me. I understand that lots of people don't have, that kind of access in their life. But during COVID, she would tell me that she would talk to, she's a good old Southern woman, and so she goes to church and all of those things. And people would ask her, about vaccines and what it was. And just to be able to explain that to someone in accessible language is also important. Because some people just don't know how to vet. They believe, like that medical journal article, anything that they see that seems credible, that's what they believe, right? And so you have to be able to be intellectually discerning. But thank you.
Thank you so much for this. Dr. Cooper Owens, it was amazing.
Thank you.
You articulated things that I teach in such an amazing way that I might steal in the future.
It is yours.
Especially the way you talk about the inheritance of the slave kind of status. But anyway, something I've been thinking about a lot in the last few weeks since the inauguration, basically, is that we see this attack on our institutions of science, like the NIH. You mentioned a lot of this data is being scrubbed from these websites and being taken down. And so we're in this crisis period, right? However, at the same time, when thinking about Black maternal health, it's been bad forever, basically. It's not like it was better on January 19th and now it's worse, right? So, and I guess this is related to what you just answered, in thinking about how we create new sons, how we move forward, what do you think about how we do that in this new moment, knowing though that this has always been a problem?
Yeah.
And it's not a new problem because of the new administration.
Yeah. I think what we do is we support the organizations that are conducting the work. We continue to, this might not be the largest gathering, right? But you're able to at least know sources. Like what I do, even if you look here, I have source, Washington Post, so I try to give that information. So you can always go back, you can cite, I give people's names, you can Google them and you can look at their research. Because the wonderful thing about being in college is that you often have access to information that, oftentimes lay audiences don't have, right? You can look at syllabi. Sometimes I would tell people, just go, type in, I don't know, race and medicine or women's health disparities or whatever, college, university, syllabus, and see what comes up. Read the reading list. Go to some of these sites. They often have, like I sit on the board of, a couple of reproductive justice organizations. And so the people that I work with on those boards are, super smart and amazing, right? And I learn so much from them. So it's really, for me, about just being able to access the information and then share it and disseminate. And these organizations, thankfully are still here. And so these Black women have been doing the work for a very long time. And they welcome interns, volunteers, employees. So that's what I would say, just go to the sources.
I just want to reiterate, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This was a wonderful experience. The topic was not wonderful at all, but I think the way that you explained everything was great. I feel thank you so much. But my question relates a little bit to archival work. How do you do your research in all of this stuff that might seem lost? How do you connect it to a greater narrative? How did you get physical archival stuff that is not from the internet because it can be limited? I wonder how you get that when it comes to these topics.
That's a great question, because when I first, it was interesting. I just kind of was interested, like, oh, here's this guy, Father of American Gynecology, and there was experimentation on enslaved people. And so initially it's just reading up with the secondary sources. And then once you look at, this is the thing grad students do, then they look at the bibliography, right? And we're like, oh, okay, let's see, the papers, because it will literally say, primary sources or archival collections. And then you start to look at those collections and you start to see, oh, okay, people are using some of the same records. And so after a while I said, well, let me look at some 19th century medical journal articles. So you go to that database and all of a sudden you're just, the ideas will start to percolate as you read, and I always say archival research is like the dating period for those who are in relationships. It feels real good because you're always discovering something and it's new and it's lovely. And so that's for me, the kind of easy part. It takes a while. And then the hard part is when you have to write. You have to process the ideas and then you have to write. And then you realize, like, oh gosh, I'm writing about people who didn't necessarily leave records. How do I do this? That's the hard part, at least for me. And so then I had to go back. All of those medical journal articles or medical case books, or even the slave narratives, the Works Progress Administration slave narratives under the Roosevelt administration, and then reread how people are talking about their experiences in healing and sickness and death. And then for me, recognizing that sometimes a phrase can give you so much. James Marion Sims wrote about one of the enslaved women. She lost sense of herself and struggled mightily. And so someone might read it and say, oh, okay, I guess it was a kind of painful procedure. And I remember thinking, wait, if Black women didn't experience pain, why would she struggle? Why would you restrain her like you would do a white patient? Because you knew ultimately that these bodies were the same. And so that's like the secondary source where you kind of start thinking about the theories, right, of reading between the lines or in the gaps. And so all of it helps you in reconstructing the narrative. But it's a great question about the sources.
Hi, Dr. Cooper Owens. I first also want to thank you. I'm so excited to read your book because, and I have two things. First, a comment and then a question. I think it's really important to have these nuanced understanding because I've done research on Sarah Barton for my own scholars research, and all of the literature I was reading in those same articulations about her stereotypia, in those same lines, they said that she had an elongated labia.
Yep.
And so you're the first sort of historian that I've come in contact with that said that she did not. So that's caused me to sort of question these things that I'm reading and writing about and making like claims about, and considering that there could possibly be a revisionist sort of lens on these things. So I definitely appreciate that. My second question is, I just want to sort of get a gauge of some of the conversations you've had in your experiences. I watched the Hulu documentary Aftershock.
Oh, yeah.
It was such a beautiful documentary, and we engaged a little bit about cesarean and C-section. As a C-section baby myself, my mom had like health conditions and health complications, endometriosis that made it difficult for her to have a natural birth. But I was also in the documentary. They said that C-sections were less expensive and more profitable than having a natural birth, and so that was always the first thing that they recommended to to mothers. And so it's really, and it's also one of the most deadliest surgeries. So I want to sort of pick your brain about some of the things that you've engaged about, alternatives to these how have you conversed about, we know that C-sections are killing us, but they seem to be like options that are promoted and encouraged within the medical field.
Yeah, it's because of the relationship with insurance companies in the hospitals. So that's one thing. But with it's funny. So Tanya Lewis Lee is coming. I'm bringing her. That was me. I'm bringing her to UConn on April 17th, the end of Black Maternal Health Week. Man, my birthday, working birthday. But yeah, to talk about Aftershock. The other thing is with C-sections, for me, it is about how do you create an actionable strategy for change. And so I'm not an activist in the way of having a bullhorn and those kinds of things, but the work that I do in terms of consulting and curriculum design with colleges of nursing or medical colleges or just certain kinds of organizations, maybe a hospital administration, is to help them create learning modules around how these things came to be. Because in medical schools, for those who are interested in going, anything humanities related is typically an elective. And so what I tend to do is use the history of Western medicine as a tactic and a strategy. I was like, well, when Hippocrates was created, as he thought medicine was an art, a practice of art, and it was much more holistic, right? The thing is, I know Western medical tradition too, because I had to teach class, right? There are not a lot of Black people who teach those classes, but the thing is, when I can speak that language of Galen and Hippocrates and all of those people, and I'm like, so he talked about music theory and art and poetry and those kinds of things. They tend to be really well read up on the sciences. They're not as well read with social science and humanities. And so when you look at the studies, the folk are not saying that the doctors don't understand the techniques or the certain procedures. What they're saying is all the things the humanities people are telling me, they're not listening to me. They're coming with assumptions based on class or race or, all of xenophobia or what have you. And so that's what I do. For doctors, I think they speak, I'm not an MD, so I can't speak that particular language with them. But it's just curriculum design, learning modules. And then the other thing is too, there has to be something that is punitive for doctors and hospitals that continue to risk the lives of their patients. Because in this country, that's typically why people change, when they have to pay fines or licenses revoked. So those kinds of things. Just very briefly on Sarah Bartman, this will be very brief. In those same writings, they describe Sarah Bartman as having green skin. I mean, so at the end of the day, I'm just kind of like, yeah, they took notes, but if you were reading about her, you would even wonder if this was a human being or not. So you have to sometimes, vet even the primary sources.
You have time for one or two more questions?
In the front.
Hello. Hi. My name is Sophie Frazier. I'm an aspiring medical professional, wealth provider, and I also am part of an organization on campus that advocates for reproductive justice.
All right.
And one of your answers really stuck with me about how can we address reproductive issues that are current within our society. And I just wanted to ask, what are like some specific organizations that address reproductive issues in case any of us in the room would like to get involved?
Sure. So the ones I noted, so I would say Black Mamas Matter, there's Ancestral Song, which is a doula organization, there's Mama Glow, which is another doula organization, there is the, my goodness, oh, I'm having a brain fog moment, there's in Kansas City, I think Jama Village, which is midwifery. There's, oh my gosh, there's so many. There's a Black midwife in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle, Shafia Monroe, who has a whole midwifery center. There's Sister Song in Atlanta. So there are a number of reproductive justice organizations. And one of the mothers of the movement who helped coin the phrase reproductive justice, along with her comrades in 1994, Loretta Ross, is an affiliation with Smith College in Massachusetts, but she is the only reproductive justice advocate to have won a MacArthur Genius Award. So she's someone who is still active in doing work. And I will give a little shout out to Jennifer Morgan. Most people think, oh, early Black Atlantic historian. She recently won a MacArthur as well, but Jennifer is a doula. And I didn't know that. We were doing some work for the National Association of Pregnant Women a few years back. And she was like, oh yeah, I do doula work. And I was like, what? Girl, I didn't know. I was like, you're like Erykah Badu of history. Who knew? So she, so there are a number of Donna Iene Davis, who wrote Reproductive Injustice, who's a scholar, another doula. So there are people, literally moving behind the scenes, trying to do this work and linking up with organizations. And the last one is IB Black Girl. It's one of the only reproductive justice organizations in the Midwest. And so Ashley Spivey is the founder, and she wanted to do even more. And the organization is amazing, and she became Nebraska's, right now, she's the only Black woman state senator in Nebraska. And so she is a reproductive justice activist with a multi-million-dollar organization, which is pretty rare for a lot of these organizations. So I hope that gives you a lot.
Thank you so much.
So we have time for one more question after this one? From the audience? Not really going to follow up, but maybe you can close us up.
Okay, this is just a short question.
Sure.
You mentioned UConn and talking about Aftershock. Can you explain a little bit more about the event?
Yes, it is. Your professors have to help run the university, so we have made chairs of committees. And so essentially my director was like, girl, you know a lot of people, create a program and do it on reproductive justice, as long as it's on Black girls and women, because they have a grant. So I was like, you know what, some people owe me some favors. So I called Tanya Lewis Lee. Well, actually, I went into her DM. So she's Spike Lee's wife. So she's like she has served on the board of lots of organizations like the March of Dimes, a number of them. And she created Aftershock with her co-director, Paula Eiselt. And so it is, for me, a really searing documentary. It's streamed on Hulu about the Black birthing crisis. And the family members who are left to advocate after the loss of their partners. So Shawnee Benton is a mother who lost her daughter, and she's actually coming to the event. There are a number of people. It is probably the hardest one I've seen. I don't like watching it. Not that it isn't good, but it is really difficult because Tanya and Paula have done a really wonderful job in showing you the loss in the community and each member of the community. So from the parents who lose their children to the children who've lost their mothers, their partners, their boyfriends or their husbands. And then even as these Black men and these Afro-Latino, men are struggling to raise children alone, they have very specific emotional needs because sometimes they're kind of kept out of those conversations because they're men. And so it's it's holistic in the way that it involves everybody, but it is just sad. So I was like, girl, we can't show the whole documentary because I don't think people can take it. But we'll have excerpts and have them speak about it. So that's what we're doing. We're just trying to highlight it, and I'm going to invite some of the reproductive justice groups and doctors and midwives who are in the area to come so we can have a robust conversation around that.
Dr. Barnes has.
Yes.
I was going to ask you separately, but I thought it might be good for students to hear my question. I'm Dr. Barnes, those of you who don't know me. I wanted to shout out Dorothy Roberts.
That's right. Another MacArthur genius winner.
Yes,
Amazing.
and wanted to shout her out with my question, which is, I know you know about her work, Fatal Intervention.
Yes.
She's most known for her reproductive work.
Killing the Black body.
Yes, Killing the Black Body, but she also wrote a book called Fatal Intervention, which was challenging pharmaceutical companies about how they are starting to label medications as specifically for one particular group or another, which, going into what you were saying before about the racialized bodies, I wondered if you could just speak, so that students could hear about it, how there are these new efforts coming about that are making it like race is a thing.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Barnes. So if you go to in fact, Dorothy Roberts has a TED Talk that's like over 1 million plus views now, where she literally brings this up. So she's like, race is a fiction. Like it's a fiction, right? And she talks about people like her. So her mother was a Black woman, her father was a white man. Right, and even though she is, like, if you look at her, you wouldn't see her as a quote-unquote stereotypical biracial person. She's like, so what about people, they cut that off. What about people like me? Because the time, it's after 6:30, so that's why. And I know, I was talking about her. Yeah, so what about people like me? And so she really questions this whole racial and biological essentialism that is ultimately false. And it's often the ways that the tests are set up. So for instance, perfect example, that spirometer that I talked about, the assesses lung capacity. This is the thing, and I'm gonna use my colleague David since I see him in the back. David said, Professor Silkenot. So we're, man, woman, we look different, all of the things, the hair texture, the features, but we could breathe into the spirometer and literally have the same score. But in the United States, guess what medical practitioners gonna do? Change it because I'm Black. So they have to account for my Blackness. We have the same score. Why do you need to do that? And you know that race is it's not biological, it's a social construct. The other thing is, like, you have studies coming out of Chicago that literally say, oh, Black people they're diagnosed with more hypertension, so what we're going to do is create a different medication for Black people with hypertension. As if somehow the bodies are different. But I can guarantee you right now, if you and I have B positive blood and we're found to be a match and I need a kidney, guess what? If there's a match, you can give me your kidney. Nobody's gonna say, oh, it's this kidney that can't. So it's these fictions, and that's what Dorothy is saying, right? That these are the fictions, that the problem is it's instituted in the building blocks of the medical industry that creates these kinds of falsehoods around biological difference, right? And so that's the thing that actually needs to change. But thank you for that.
Let's give Dr. Cooper Owens one more round of applause. And we have a parting gift with Dr. Cooper Owens, who's all our Miller Scholar speakers. We appreciate the talk, and it'll be up on our website next few days for folks to look at it, tell your friends, tell your colleagues. Great conversation. Thank you for coming out. Everybody have a good evening. Thank you.